Welcome back to another episode of Swamp Stories. For this episode, we continue the New Orleans series. But before we get into it, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you're new. You can also follow the Instagram page as well. Also, if you haven't seen episode 1, make sure to go check that out first. So let's get into it. The mid-2000s can be seen as the end of the New Orleans era, and not because the music stopped, but because it was time for all the rappers to leave the city. Between 2002 and 2004, just about every New Orleans rapper had packed their bags and left. Cash Money decided to move their operations to a much better place. Their music kept getting better and better, and Lil Wayne started becoming the new face of Cash Money. But the move to Miami was not well received by everyone. A lot of people felt like they were selling out, but honestly, how can you blame Cash Money? New Orleans doesn't seem like a place for people to grow. Once you reach a certain level, the community either wants you to stay there, or if you grow past it, they want to take you down. And that doesn't just apply to rappers. Anytime someone is seeing success, or even simple things like getting attention from the girls, someone is bound to get jealous and try to end it all. That's just the nature of the 504, crabs in a bucket mentality. Well, while Cash Money moved and started prospering, No Limit began heading down a very different path. In the late 90s to early 2000s, Master P became the wealthiest man in Louisiana. In fact, in 1998, he made over $160 million. But from 2001 on, things began to really slow down. Many people would say that the music just wasn't keeping up with the Cash Money standard. Master P's brother Silk the Shocker was even dubbed as one of the worst rappers in history. Some would even say that he was allergic to rapping on beat. But it wasn't just that. The departure of Soulja Slim played a big part as well. Something that I didn't cover in the last video is how Master P and Soulja Slim's relationship turned sour. A New Orleans rapper named Crazy says that everything went bad after Soulja Slim came home from Angola. He came home expecting $100,000 from Master P, but he may have only received $50,000. And once he spent the $50,000, he asked for some more. And it's not that he was entitled, it's just that before he went down, No Limit had so much expendable cash that he never really had to ask. But at this point, the budget had shrunk, and that was not easy for him to handle. So Soulja Slim decided that he could do better by himself and parted ways with No Limit. But sadly, shortly after, he passed away. And this is when the blame game started. Soulja Slim's sister named Peaches claims that Master P had something to do with it, and Juvenile blames those around Soulja Slim along with the whole city of New Orleans. But either way, Slim's passing was a sign of the times for No Limit, and for these reasons, No Limit's clock began ticking fast. By 2004, the label officially filed for bankruptcy, and all of that is why 2004 was the end of the New Orleans rap scene. But not only would the music change, the entire dynamic of the streets of New Orleans as well, especially in the year 2005. But before we get into it, let me run the intro. 2005 may have been the most important year in New Orleans history, and the madness started on August 29th, 2005, when one of the worst hurricanes ever reported swept through the city. Residents knew for 6 days in advance that the storm was coming, and everyone who had the means to evacuate did. However, those who didn't have transportation or money for hotel rooms were absolutely stuck, and many of these residents happened to live in the city's 12 public housing projects. But everything was looking okay until the eye of the storm hit on August 29th at 6 in the morning. Residents had gone to sleep having no idea what they were about to wake up to. 174-mile-per-hour winds began causing major destruction. Roofs started coming off of houses, windows began shattering, and cars started flipping over. But there were 12 areas that had virtually zero damage. That would be all the housing projects, which engineers called hurricane-proof buildings. But as the storm passed, what would happen next was unexpected. At 9 a.m., the first levee broke and water began flooding into the city. And over the next 24 hours, each levee began to break one at a time, and water filled in the city at every angle. And for those who don't know, New Orleans is below sea level, and the levees are the only reason that New Orleans is not under underwater. Well, by 10 p.m., the last levee broke and the city was like a fishbowl filled with water. All of the electricity was out. And on top of this, the weather rose to 95 degrees. The city of New Orleans became an absolute swamp with no AC, no electricity, and no food or water. And it would remain that way for the next 5 days. On September 3rd, the Coast Guard and US Army would begin sending aid to the city. But this effort was a major failure. And that's not to blame the people who came to help, but rather to blame the pathetic response of those in power. This even prompted Kanye West to make critical statements on live TV. You know, back when he was the real Kanye West. Well, for days, residents were placed inside the Superdome, which became the shelter for everyone. But this wasn't exactly a pleasant experience. In fact, many people did not make it out. Let me explain. The Magnolia and Calliope happened to run into each other in the Superdome, and rumors say that it did not end peacefully. You'd think that everyone would forget their rivalries during a natural disaster, but in New Orleans, the beef never stops. Well, what would happen next is a fascinating story that many people don't know about. Once the city was deemed unlivable and residents were not allowed to return to their homes, buses came and took them to Houston, Texas. First, they were given vouchers to stay at hotels, and then FEMA came in and gave them thousands of dollars in relief funds. And for many of these people, this was the most money they had ever had in their pocket. Now, I don't want to paint the picture like everyone was doing bad things, because that's certainly not the case. However, those who were up to no good were able to cause Houston police to panic. The New Orleans guys began embedding themselves in Houston and seeking to take control. These guys were menaces that Houston had never seen before, and the numbers speak for themselves. Houston's homicide rate spiked to its highest levels of all time, and that's because of guys like this. Let me introduce you to the most legendary man in Magnolia history. A man by the name of Ivory Harris, also known as Be Stupid. He was the most feared man in all of New Orleans before Katrina. And after numerous attempts to take him down, New Orleans police had to release him every single time. And that was due to the 60-day rule. So let me recap from the first video. The 60-day rule is a New Orleans law where all charges are dropped if the police can't present a witness in 60 days. Well, Ivory Harris was arrested 19 times between 2002 and 2005, but he never spent more than 60 days behind bars. But things are much different in Texas, and Ivory Harris would learn that pretty quickly. And that takes us to December 17th, 2005. At 2 in the morning, Ivory Harris decides to go hang out at a Southwest Houston pool hall. And at this time, not only was Ivory feared, but he also was rolling in tons of cash. While at the pool hall, he notices a man named Jack Griffin, who happens to be from the Calliope projects. So Ivory allegedly waits for him outside the pool hall. Bam! This time it was a miss, but he wouldn't be done trying. Later that night at around 4:20, he would drive to the Wilcrest Apartments. That's where he would find Jack Griffin. Bam! Houston police would later locate an abandoned car that matched the pool hall incident as well. And Ivory Harris was now a wanted man. But he wasn't a man who worried much, because on February 28th, he would casually attend the Mardi Gras festival. And that's where he would find a man named Jermaine Wise, a rival from the Holly Grove neighborhood. Bam! On March 16th, 2006, Ivory Harris finally went down. And this is where major investigations began. Houston police tied Ivory Harris to 3 bodies in December 2005 alone. And listen to this, they pinned his friends with 11 bodies combined. Mind you, this all happened in under 3 months. The Magnolia was causing damage that Houston had never seen before. Well, Ivory Harris ended up receiving 25 years in 2007. And that takes us to a new era in New Orleans, which I would call the rebuilding era. Most of the city was destroyed during the hurricane, so it took a while for people to return. Most families got comfortable in Houston and Atlanta and decided that they were never looking back. In fact, the already shrinking city lost over half its residents. It went from 500,000 down to 230,000 residents in under a year and a half. But not only did the city shrink, but the landscape and street politics did a complete 180. So let me explain. In the 3rd Ward, a lot of the houses were damaged and needed full renovations to be livable again. However, the projects were completely fine. The engineers from the 1940s were absolutely right. These buildings were hurricane proof. So many of the Magnolia, Calliope, and Melf residents returned in 2006, but big news came in 2007. The city of New Orleans decided to knock down all 12 housing projects. They claimed that the storm damaged them and they needed to be torn down, which many people will tell you is absolutely false. So in 2007, all residents received a slip on the door saying that they had to move out by a certain date, and if not, all of their belongings were to be demolished with the buildings. So maybe the city was really looking out for its public housing residents and wanted to give them new homes. Or maybe there was something else going on, which would later be revealed. The city had sold all of their public housing land to a private real estate developer, and the plan was not quite beneficial to the residents. By 2008, they tore down nearly all 1,400 units of the Magnolia housing project, and they decided to rebuild it into a 460 unit mixed income community of townhomes. And honestly, they look great, so you'd think that this really helped the community. Well, except for the fact that they cost $1,300 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment, and this is definitely a price that many residents cannot afford. And the exact same thing happened to the Calliope and Melf as well. So the entire dynamic of the 3rd Ward changed. So you may be wondering, where did the displaced residents go? And this here is the most interesting topic of the whole story. Let me introduce you to New Orleans East, a neighborhood separated by bridges from the rest of the city. The East was the last built neighborhood in New Orleans and was actually built as a suburb. The houses have big yards and most have 2 stories at least. In fact, this is where Birdman and Lil Wayne bought mansions before moving to Miami. Before the hurricane, living in the East was a status symbol. It was like you were successful enough to make it out of the real New Orleans. In fact, it was the fastest growing neighborhood in the city, and a ton of brand new houses and apartments were being built. But after New Orleans' population dropped, many of these houses became vacant and foreclosed. So the city decided to give out Section 8 vouchers to all of the public housing residents from the 3rd Ward. And this is where the former suburb became the center of all madness. At first, many people believed that moving them into these big houses would improve their life. However, the old lifestyle of the 3rd Ward never changed, and the rivalries remained as well. So let me break it all down. Although most members now live in New Orleans East, they still represent and hang in the 3rd Ward. The Magnolia now consists of 2 groups, the Bird Gang and the Dooney Boys. They're represented by rappers Nino Calvin and Magnolia Shorty. And these days, the Magnolia has 3 rivals. First, you have the Calliope, which consists of a group called the Calliope Ghosts, and they are no joke either. Then you have another group called 3NG, who represent 3rd and Galvez. And between these 3, it's a triangle of madness. I can't possibly cover everything that's happened because there are literally hundreds and hundreds of events. And if you don't believe me, please just look it up. So instead, I'm going to focus on the most important events. And that takes us to Mardi Gras 2009. And for those who don't know, Mardi Gras is the littest time of the year in New Orleans. People fly in from all over the world to go to the parades, and the entire city parties for a week straight. But locals know another side to Mardi Gras. They know that it's the most dangerous week of the year. That's because rivals are bound to run into each other at the parades, and in New Orleans there's no telling what will happen. And that takes us to February 25th, 2009. 2 Magnolia Bird members, Louis Lazone and Mark Brooks, run into a group of 3NG members in the middle of the parade. And without hesitation, bam! This event made national news, and that might be the reason it was solved very quickly. But this just goes to show that it's on site no matter who's around, and that trend would continue. Let me introduce you to one of the most notorious 3rd Ward men of all time, a man named Christopher McCann, also known as Boogie. He was the leader and founder of 3NG, and he was absolutely insane. But by the time he was older, he was directing everything that was going down. And in 2010, he would do the unthinkable. At the time, the Magnolia's biggest rapper was a woman named Magnolia Shorty. She was signed to Cash Money and earned the nickname Queen of Bounce. And although she was just a rapper, being from the Magnolia comes with consequences. And that takes us to December 20th, 2010. Magnolia Shorty is booked to perform at a carnival show in Miami, so she heads to the airport. But halfway through the drive, she realized she forgot something at home. So she heads back to the Georgetown apartments in New Orleans East. As soon as she pulls into the apartments, 3 men are right there. Bam! This shocked the city. But everyone knew what it was all about. 4 3NG men were later arrested, but despite the takedown, they were not done yet. November 17th, 2011. Magnolia Shorty's husband, Carl Bridgewater, is 2 blocks down from the Magnolia projects. Bam! Events like this would continue back and forth for the next few years, but an old name would pop back up in 2011. That would be Darrell Smith, known as the man responsible for Soulja Slim and 3 others from the Magnolia project. Well, he had been laying low in Houston ever since, but in 2011 he decided to return to New Orleans. And although the incidents were almost 8 years in the past, the Magnolia could never forgive him for what he did. And that takes us to August 13th, 2011. Darrell Smith decides to visit the former St. Bernard projects in the 7th Ward, but somehow the Magnolia knew exactly where he was. Bam! This would be a major storyline in New Orleans, most likely because everyone knew he was the one who took down Soulja Slim. But in the Magnolia, some positivity would finally come their way. A rapper named Nino Calvin began making noise in Louisiana. He is the son of a legendary street millionaire. However, he spent most of his childhood in Sandy Springs, Georgia, and even went to high school with Playboy Cardi and Summer Walker. But regardless, when he was in New Orleans, he dealt with the consequences of being from the Magnolia project. And that takes us to May 14th, 2018. Nino Calvin and his brother are driving along Interstate 610. That's when a car rolls by. Bam! Instantly, Nino pulls to the side and realizes what just happened. He gets out of the car and sees red everywhere. But that's when a fan notices him and yells out his name out of fandom. She then realizes he's injured and puts him in the backseat of her car and drives him to the ER. Thankfully, he was okay. But let's not make the Magnolia seem like they're always on the other end of everything. And that takes us to November of 2020. The Magnolia somehow connects with a woman in Grass Valley, California. And for those who don't know, this is a small Northern California town known for nothing except for grass, if you know what I mean. Well, the Magnolia guys drive all the way out there to spend $30,000 on you know what. Well, actually they weren't there to buy anything at all. So they met up with the woman and handed her $30,000 of fake money. When she notices that the money's fake, she gets in her car and chases them down. But the Magnolia boys were not playing. Bam! The men were later found at a hotel in Davis, California. Well, I hope this gave you a taste of New Orleans, and if you want to see more Louisiana videos, let me know in the comments. Or if you want me to cover anything, just DM me on Instagram. That's gonna do it for this episode of Swamp Stories. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Peace!